Welcome back to another episode of the Max Term Podcast. Kyle Stitch here alongside James Finch. And today we're going to look at Frank Seravalli's recently published trade targets, his top 20 names to watch 100 days away from the trade deadline. We appreciate you listening to this podcast. We're available on all major platforms that you might consume a podcast on. Appreciate you subscribing, giving us a follow on Twitter, now X, I guess. At MaxTermPod. We also tweet a lot at AFP Analytics. That's where we tweet a lot of our analysis and stuff like that, especially as it comes to signings and everything. Our personal accounts can easily be found from the at AFP Analytics handle. All accounts, including personal and the AFP Analytics and Max Term Podcast, are also available on Blue Sky. We appreciate you giving us a follow over there as well. Haven't put a lot of content up, but at some point we probably will actually start to utilize that platform. And any ads, anything like that, are not necessarily products that we're working with endorsing. We'll be very overt if we are working with anyone or anything like that. And finally, no, we're going based on Frank Seravalli's trade board, our own knowledge, no inside information for this episode or anything like that. So our opinions are informed opinions, I guess you could say. And with that, Frank Seravalli released his top 20 names, trade target board, if you will, 100 days to the deadline. And I think our plan will just be to run through, well, probably not run through, but talk through names 1 through 20. Ironically, one was very recently just traded. We'll get there in a minute. And we'll start right at the top, talk about player, talk about maybe some team fits, what we think the kind of the current team should do, who would make sense to acquire this player as well. So number 1 on his board, Elias Lindholm, center, Calgary Flames. He will be a pending unrestricted free agent. His cap hit right now, well, his cap hit for this season, I should say, $4.85 million. So nothing absurd, but also a lot of teams that are tight are going to have a level of difficulty fitting that without retaining any salary.
Yeah, and there's always the option of kind of taking on a contract, and in this case, it probably wouldn't have to be a huge one. So taking a player, not making a whole lot back in a trade to make it fit. 4.85, I would guess it's not the amount that a team takes on. It's most likely going to include some salary retention in a trade. But yeah, like you said, I mean, we can see it right here. Lindholm is the number 1 trade target, at least as of right now, and part of that is because he's a high-level, high-performance center. The first team that pops into my head that I think should be all over this, and this isn't a new opinion, we've talked about it over the offseason, Boston Bruins.
Yeah, that's exactly who I was going to kind of say as my first team as well. The Boston Bruins, ideally, like they're off to a really good start. We think that there could be a level of regression. Actually, we've kind of seen that the past week. We talk about regression and everything, which teams we bought into their early season start sold in our kind of Black Friday special that was recently released. So also encourage you to listen back to that one. But I agree, Elias Lindholm and the Boston Bruins makes a ton of sense. The issue is Boston would have to probably send someone who is a contributor, if you will, out. Maybe they can move one of their defensemen and kind of shift around there. I guess Matt Grzelcyk's probably the easiest name. Maybe not the most ideal, but probably the easiest to, I guess, start with talking about.
Yeah, I think looking at the roster, it most likely does come from the blue line. I think Lindholm would be an improvement on a lot of the forwards on the Bruins, but with the need at forward, and specifically center, if you subtract a larger salary from the forward group, you're not really netting as much as you would like to. On the blue line, Grzelcyk, definitely. I could see them trying to pawn off Derek Forbort on a team. That would really kind of be where it has to come from at this point in the season, unless there's an injury we don't know about. Or, I mean, we're talking about this right now, but that doesn't mean a trade's going to happen right now. This could happen in a month, 2 months even. So, like, there's a lot unknown. A lot of things can happen before a trade actually goes down. But, they either need to send someone back, or honestly, someone who is fairly important to the team is going to have to be hurt for this trade to work out.
So I had brought up Matt Grzelcyk strictly because he's the one without any sort of trade protection, so they can send him wherever he wants, or wherever they want, not wherever he wants.
Yeah.
Derek Forbort has a level of trade protection. It looks like he has an 8, I guess only a 3-team no trade list at this point, so I think that means he can name 3 teams he can't be traded to. So I don't know if the Calgary Flames would be one of those teams or not. It feels like I can name 3 more that I put on my list before Calgary, but at the same point, maybe moving cross country is not maybe the desired thing here. So maybe it is 3 West Coast or out West teams anyways.
Well, I was going to say, maybe if you don't want to go to Western Canada, there's your 3 teams. So not to say that's the case here. We have no idea, but in theory, they could be on there, but yeah, I agree. I would probably have a handful or 2 of other teams I'd put on there first. Grzelcyk is the most obvious as far as being able to trade him, for sure.
I have one other roster player name from the Bruins before I give you another team as well that I kind of like for Lindholm. Trent Frederic. I know we don't want to necessarily subtract forwards. We want to kind of improve, upgrade, but if you're looking at a forward, it's him or Jake DeBrusk, but DeBrusk is a UFA at the end of this year. He's free to sign anywhere, so Calgary, I don't know if they would be real interested in doing that unless they could kind of involve a third team in this. Trent Fredericks has this year, next year, then would be an unrestricted free agent, a UFA who could walk and talk to anyone, but at the same point, Calgary could also get an extension done this summer with him. He could be the type of player that Calgary kind of desires to, a little bit more grit, a little bit more versatile down the lineup. I don't know. I'm just looking at the forwards. I agree with you. There aren't many names, but to me, he's the one that stands out just a little bit.
Yeah, the thing I would say there, you kind of mentioned I guess, finding that grit, that type of player for Calgary. Boston went into the season with a certain amount of that in their lineup, and it is not currently at the same amount, and it probably won't be, I'm assuming, with the Lucic situation that's going on. I assume he won't be back. I don't know that, though. Trent Frederic, to me, is the type of player you could get rid of. I don't know if Boston would want to do that themselves. They might see him as kind of part of their culture at this point. Although the other thing I'll say, you mentioned DeBrusk. Once we start getting to that level of player in the lineup, I can see Boston just kind of looking elsewhere if they have to move someone like that. He's a top 6 winger for them, and you start to really not see enough of a positive in making a deal. You mentioned you have another team for Lindholm.
I do have a second team I like. Real quickly for Boston, we kind of mentioned they don't have cap space. They're projected to right now, because they're using long-term injured reserve, have $712,500 in space at the deadline. That's according to Cap Friendly. So again, they can't fit Lindholm. They can't fit him in even if Calgary were to retain 50%. My other team, and I think back in the summer, we did kind of a fun episode where we like trade targets. Pittsburgh Penguins. I still like that idea for Elias Lindholm. I mean, you can roll out one of Crosby, Malkin, or Lindholm on the ice almost at all times, or put them together and just, a more potent lineup. I really like that fit, and Pittsburgh's a team that really should be doing everything they can to add to their lineup.
Yeah, so looking at their lineup, they've kind of got some names in there that are decent depth guys, but not necessarily not anyone you would say is a definite regular. Harkins, I'd say Matt Nieto to an extent, possibly a Drew O'Connor. Like these are fine guys to have in your bottom six, but they've got some space at the upper half of their forward lines here. Hinostroza's kind of been in there a little bit. They definitely have the space in the lineup. It would be making the money work here. But I would say I would almost like the idea of them just strengthening down the middle. Lars Eller, Noel Acciari, Jeff Carter, they're all kind of playing a third or fourth line role down the middle, and I think pushing those guys a little bit lower, you could potentially run three lines centered by Crosby, Malkin, and Lindholm, and that most teams are going to have trouble matching up with in the playoffs.
Yeah, so Pittsburgh salary cap wise, right now, they were recording this, they are using long-term injured reserve with Rickard Rakell, and that's a big if he were to stay on basically long-term injured reserve until the end of the season, no salary cap in the playoffs, they would have the ability to add Lindholm at 50% salary retained. They don't quite need the 50, but they have $2.75 million in cap space right now, and that would be the same at the deadline because it's long-term injured reserve space. Is it realistic to expect? I don't think Rakell's injury is going to keep him out until the playoffs. Could someone else end up on long-term injured reserve? Sure, but we're kind of talking the exact same thing as we did with the Bruins in that they probably have to move someone out, which probably makes this a little bit tougher unless they can get Jeff Carter's the obvious name, but I don't know how easy that's going to be to accomplish.
Yeah, I quickly Googled Rickard Rakell. Pretty much seeing undisclosed upper body injury, so that's fairly normal for the NHL. I did see in an article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that it was mentioned he's out longer term. Again, we don't know what that means. That could mean he's back by the deadline because that's a bit of a ways away, but maybe it is possible he would be out until the playoffs or even further than that. That said, I do think Carter would be an obvious one to try and move out. The big factor there is the 35 plus no move. And if I'm him, I'm probably not wanting to move if it means going to a team that isn't contending. So yeah, it could be tough to make a deal happen unless, again, there are injuries still.
I will point out, Lars Eller is almost exactly 50% of Elias Lindholm's contract. In theory, that could work. I mean, again, you have no cap space left after that, and you probably have to do I don't know if Calgary's wants Lars Eller, and I don't even know if Pittsburgh should be okay moving him to add Elias Lindholm, but I don't know if that's their desired path either.
Yeah, and I almost wonder, and I think this is tough to gauge because it's different situation to situation, but when you have a guy who just signed a contract for more than a year, the optics, more not even from a fan standpoint, but just within the room, within the NHL, of you just signed a guy to a multi-year contract and now you're trading him. I don't know if that would impact a decision at all there, but it possibly could, and with it being more of a veteran, someone who's 34, has been in the league for a while, he might kind of be given the benefit of the doubt there, and he would stay in Pittsburgh. I don't know. That's more something that, in theory, could weigh a little bit into the decision-making. That is interesting, though, because in theory that is an option because ultimately Eller would not be able to block it. I like the team fit enough that it's something to keep an eye on roster-wise where Pittsburgh's at in the I'll say weeks leading up to the deadline would be my guess.
Let me give two more teams that actually would have the salary cap space that I think would be kind of fun here. One would be kind of the team that drafted him, the Carolina Hurricanes. I mean, they have a plethora of forwards, of good forwards already, but he's good enough that you make that work in your lineup. I mean, if you can add a center of his caliber, you do that.
Yeah, so they're probably one of the top teams of, you look at their forward lineup and there isn't necessarily a hole there. People get hurt. I'm going to say it's going to happen. I don't think it's a move they rush into right now, but if Lindholm's still in Calgary and available more towards the deadline, deeper into the season, it would make sense. Like you said, you make that move happen. I think they've got a lot of solid players in Carolina, but if you wanted to point at a weakness, it could be down the middle. They could use just a little bit more elite talent. Although Kotkaniemi is playing fairly decent this year, so it's not quite the same situation as last year. But I like Carolina as an option for sure.
Okay, let me give two dark horse. I know I said two a minute ago, but another one popped in when I'm looking here. The Buffalo Sabres, if they want to add, kind of, if they want to start making a push, haven't gotten the level of center play. Casey Middlestad's been really good. Tage Thompson's out. Tage Thompson was really good when he was playing, but they haven't gotten enough out of a Dylan Cousins and Peyton Krebs this year that I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. I don't think that he's the player they go for, but if they're looking to make kind of an aggressive move, that could be interesting, especially if something happens to one of those centers or Dylan Cousins still is not kind of playing at the level he needs to.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I want to mention with Lindholm is he has a history of playing the wing as well, a bit of a versatile player. So in a situation like Buffalo's, if everyone gets healthy and going at center, in theory, you could argue that Lindholm would possibly fit, especially when you look at kind of where some injuries are happening, where it might be a little thin, and Buffalo is on the wing right now. Some guys will be coming back in the near future, like a Jack Quinn. So the forward need might be lessened a little bit as time goes on this season. But at the same time, they're kind of, at this current moment, they're an injury to a big player away from, I don't want to say hitting the panic button at forward, but it starts to get a bit thin there.
Yeah, I mean, Lindholm has wing flexibility, and I think some of the current centers, Dylan Cousins and Casey Middlestad, have also played pretty well at wing. My final kind of under the radar team, when we did the Black Friday episode, we probably wouldn't have been talking about them, but we bought into a level of progress from the Nashville Predators, and I think they would be, if they can keep taking steps forward and other teams in the West start to pull back, they would be a fun fit for Lindholm, and that could be a team that isn't just viewing him as a rental player.
Yeah, so Nashville has a ton of cap space, at least in comparison to everyone else. They're currently, for this season, they've got 10.5 to work with. Going, not to go too in-depth with Nashville, but looking ahead, they are going to have cap space to work with in the future, in the near future specifically. This was a team where when you were mentioning different teams for Lindholm, I was going to kind of bring them up if you hadn't. Right now, they're kind of at like the 500 level record-wise. They're still in the hunt for the playoffs, not out of reach whatsoever. they're a team that you look at overall, the team's underlying numbers. I would expect the outcomes of these games for the Predators to start going a little bit more in their favor. More to say that those underlying numbers, I think, paint a good picture about this Predators team, both offensively and defensively so far, with the caveat that their goaltending play to start the season was not what we would have expected. Saros did not start strong. You'd think he rebounds over the full year, and if the rest of the team can keep playing the way they are, they're a contender. You look at their forward lineup, there's absolutely space for Lindholm now and long term. I would love to see them make that move.
Any other teams for Lindholm before we move on to the next name, who I don't know how much time we'll spend on because I think it's a lot of the same teams?
Yeah. Specifically, I'm going to say no. I think there are some other teams who, in theory, could be interested, but we'd mostly just be throwing the contenders around.
Yeah, maybe Washington Capitals should be mentioned a little bit, given that they don't have... It seems like Nick Backstrom's unfortunately done, so maybe they're a team, but maybe Washington might make a little bit more sense for the next name on the list, Sean Monahan. And I say that because Washington, like Boston, Pittsburgh, don't have the cap space. They're right up against it already. Well, I guess they would have more cap space because of the long-term injured reserve for Backstrom. So maybe they make more sense for Lindholm. But anyways, Sean Monahan next on the list. Again, I think Boston, Pittsburgh are two obvious teams here, especially considering he would be cheaper. Who else do you got?
So he kind of seems like he hasn't had the greatest of luck with injuries. So I wonder if he ends up more with a team that doesn't necessarily have to upgrade, but just kind of has the luxury of doing so. Not to repeat a team, but Carolina, I think, would be like, just from a play style perspective, he fits right in with what Carolina looks for. With how Carolina operates, too, I would almost expect them, maybe they would lean towards Monahan as the cheaper from a salary standpoint and a trade asset standpoint. They might actually lean Monahan over Lindholm. But at the same time, I think the biggest, well, other than the level of play, the biggest difference between Lindholm and Monahan, like you mentioned, it's the salary. So teams that kind of stand out to me that, yes, right now they would have trouble doing it, but depending on injuries, they might be able to make it work. Vegas, Colorado, those are the teams that, especially if they could get Montreal to maybe retain, Monahan, I think, would fit in very well there in kind of that third line role.
Yeah, I was looking at those teams, and then I'll also kind of throw out a little bit the Devils and the Florida Panthers. Could be teams that could benefit from adding a veteran, kind of versatile player that can kind of fit what they already have, as you said, a player that can fit what they already have, but give a level of insurance or marginal upgrades. I think that applies a little bit more to Florida in this situation. I think him in Florida would make a lot of sense to just add another option for them to play in their middle six or even their bottom six and allow them to maybe move like an Anton Lundell even more up the lineup and play him there consistently.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with Monahan is going to be our team's comfortable relying on him pretty much. When he's healthy, he is playing a very solid game, but that's the big issue is if he's going to stay healthy. And if you're making a move needing to improve for sure, or maybe one of your top guys is out hurt and you need a replacement, I think he could do it. But you make that trade, he could get hurt at some point, and then you're kind of back to square one, going back into the trade market. It's why I mentioned it could be a better fit for those teams that view him as a luxury move. Those teams that kind of already have the depth, but he's insurance, like you said.
Any other teams for Monahan before we move on to Chris Tanev at number 3 on Seravalli's big board?
I'll say yes. I would wonder if their season continues to be going well enough, especially with a new recent addition. Detroit would be interesting. I think they, as a team, could still use some depth at forward. And I guess kind of everything I've been saying with Monahan, in my opinion, I think he could end up going for a little bit cheaper trade price just because of that injury history. So I could see a team like Detroit, who just added Patrick Kane, if they don't go all out for a big addition, they might sneakily be able to add Monahan into the lineup.
Yeah, I guess I don't hate that idea either. I think my only reservation with Detroit is they kind of have their... I know he has a level of wing flexibility, but they have kind of two similar centers already that...
They
honestly,
like him.
If they were gonna swing, I'd rather see them swing for Lindholm than Monahan. But that's me.
Yeah, I agree. I do agree with that for sure. We'll see what happens. I don't. They're not a favorite in my opinion for Monahan, but it's a move that I could see them making based off of the type of forwards they like to have in the lineup.
So I'm actually gonna. So I said Chris Tanev's up next. Let's hit number 4, which is Nikita Zadorov, who was just traded from Calgary to Vancouver for a 3rd round pick, 5th round pick, or was it a 6th?
I believe it's a 5th in the upcoming draft, 2024.
Yeah, so it looks. So the Vancouver Canucks official announcement was they acquired Nikita Zadorov in exchange for a 5th round pick in the 2024 NHL entry draft, which was acquired from Chicago, and a 3rd round pick in 2026. Might be some conditions attached to that. If you're curious about conditions on a 5th round pick, go to capfriendly.com. It's a 5th round pick.
Yeah. No. So it's the condition on that pick is yes, it's going to be a 5th round. It's just what is the best 5th rounder that Chicago has? Probably going to be Chicago's.
Only NHL GMs are going to haggle over like the better of a 5th round pick. Like, come on, what are we doing here? Like,
no, I know, but yeah. So a 5th in 24, a 3rd in 2026. Overall, that doesn't seem like a whole lot for Zadorov. Looking at the full context of this, though, Zadorov is making a little over $4 million, I believe.
Just under 4.
Just under 4? Okay, so that's fairly significant for a team to add without any salary retained. And I think that's kind of a big part of this, that if people aren't realizing it initially, dig a little deeper here. We already went over Lindholm. We're about to go over Tanev after we finish up this Zadorov, and then there's Noah Hanifin. 3 more players that Calgary is going to want to trade. All 3 probably more valuable than Zadorov. All 3 of them with a salary that is not going to be easily fit in with a lot of contenders. You're going to want to be able to have the option to retain salary, and you can only retain on 3. So being able to move out Zadorov, getting some assets back, and not needing to retain salary really keeps the door wide open for an, I guess, easier time navigating the trade market for the Calgary Flames.
I think that's the perfect way to lay out Zadorov. For Vancouver, fine. I think that was a... We had jokingly, after they trade Anthony Beauvillier, I kind of jokingly said, well, it depends. Let's see how they use that cap space. And I think Zadorov is absolutely fine. That's a good use of that cap space. Not going to knock that. I jokingly said, watch them move out Beauvillier and then bring in Rasmus Ristolainen, and then that's not such a good move. But Zadorov, I think, is absolutely fine. Fits fine in their lineup. I have no problems with it. Gave up a not much. So good move for Vancouver. And hey, if things do go sideways, I'm not necessarily expecting them at this point to not be a playoff team. But if things were to go sideways, there's still enough time to probably flip them again and recoup as much, if not more, later in the closer to the deadline.
Possibly. And I guess one more thing I want to point out from Calgary's perspective. So if they definitely wanted to move Zadorov without retaining salary, there are 6 teams capable, without including Vancouver, there were 6 teams capable of taking on Zadorov's salary. Of the 6, I see 2 who might be buyers, most likely. Buffalo Sabres and Nashville Predators. And let's say they both had interest, just for the fun of it. Let's say they both had interest in Zadorov along with Vancouver. That's only 3 teams. To be able to still get a 3rd and a 5th for Zadorov at this point, when not that many people could fit, or not many teams could fit that salary, I actually think a 3rd and a 5th is pretty good considering the situation.
And I'd argue, I mean, I don't think Buffalo would really have interest in a defenseman at this point, given they've created their own logjam, and they have, and part of that logjam is similar players to Zadorov, so maybe Nashville would have made sense.
They have, I mean, you could argue whether or not Nashville should improve on certain players, but their defense has been fine, and there isn't a clear spot for a defenseman. They kind of make much more sense to acquire a forward. So, yeah, so I was kind of, I guess, being a little bit generous as far as what the trade market for Zadorov might have been with no salary retained. Yes, there's other teams with long-term injured reserve. I wasn't factoring that in, but to not have to retain any salary, a 3rd and a 5th, that's, I think it's not going to be recognized how good of a return that was.
Yeah, maybe the Arizona Coyotes as well could be a potential buyer, could be like, but again, as you said, we're stretching, and then I think the Capitals would be the only other team who's got enough LTIR, long-term injured reserve space, to have fit him at the full cap hit. And again, I'm not sure that that's the move that they're making. So, yeah, Calgary might have actually been really smart. Like when I first saw the return, I will say I was underwhelmed, but now talking it out, thinking through it a little bit more, it makes a lot of sense, and maybe it's going to be a smart and savvy move because, as we said, Monahan, let's lump the next 2 together. Chris Tanev, Noah Hanifin are very, very similar, carrying Tanev 4.5, Hanifin just under 5 at $4.95 million. Tanev right, but a little bit older, a little more wear and tear. Hanifin left. Young will be both will be unrestricted free agents, but Hanifin, if you're acquiring, you're more likely to also want to sign to a long-term contract, where Tanev, I think you're viewing as a kind of a rental. So defensive needy teams are going to be calling Calgary, and I'll throw out probably the neediest defensive team right now, Toronto Maple Leafs. I think people would argue that they should go after Tanev. I like the idea of Hanifin for them a lot.
Yeah, so Tanev to me is more of the lockdown defenseman type. Hanifin, I think, is at this point a little more well-rounded. Definitely more of an offensive guy than Tanev is. I mean, I'm going to say if I'm Toronto, I would pretty much take either of them. I do think I like Hanifin as the better fit. Main thing with Toronto is they will definitely need salary retained on both of, regardless of which defenseman it is. Do want to mention, just so we have the numbers, so Tanev is making $4.5 million. Hanifin is making $4.95 million. At this point in time, Maple Leafs could fit a little over $2 million. Going to need some salary retained, possibly, depending on which defenseman it is, might need to send someone out as well. It would be great if they could get rid of Ryan Reeves or just go back in time and not sign that contract. Not going to go down that rabbit hole right now.
We've
but...
been down that rabbit hole almost every episode that we've talked about kind of current events, recent happenings in the NHL, if you will. So I will point out, so right now at this moment, they do have that $2.3 million in cap space. That includes, so Muzzin, Murray done for the season. That's known. It involves John Klingberg and Timothy Liljegren, who it seems like Klingberg might get stashed on long-term injured reserve for the remainder of the season. Maybe he'll miraculously be healthy for the playoffs, but it seems like that's what's the case there. Timothy Liljegren is going to be back at some point. $1.4 million. So really, the cap space that they're probably going to have to work with to acquire anyone is about $900,000 ish. So that's not going to fit them with just the salary retained. So someone has to go out, and I think this is, I mean, we had trouble sending guys out on other teams. Toronto's even tougher to send out because, as you said, Ryan Reeves is the obvious one, but that's going to be near impossible to do. You're not sending out a defense. Well, there's really no defenseman making enough that's worth sending out. Like TJ Brody, sure, but that's a lateral move, if not a step down. And then forwards, I mean, are you going to send out a Bertuzzi or Domi? Maybe David Kampf?
Here's the other issue with a lot of their forwards, especially around that salary range that you might look to flip that guy out. They've all got some form of no trade protection. And even the guys that have the modified no trade, you start to look through, and they are pretty much able to block 10 teams. And once a list includes 10 teams, Calgary might be on there at this point. There's ways to be creative. You flip them to a different team. I more just think it's important to mention that as it gets tougher, even when you look at, well, which player should we get rid of? Who would other teams be fine acquiring? The other thing with some of those forwards around that, let's say $2 to $3 million range, that in theory it would free up the right amount of space. So you mentioned David Kampf. He's got $2.4 million left on 4 years, so 3 more after this season. $2.4 million is not a lot, but to willingly take back a player, I don't know if I'm really interested in doing that if I'm Calgary, especially Calgary, probably a team that wants to retool quickly after trading some of these stars. Kaya Yarncroc, $2.1 million the next 2 years after this season, same type of thing. Making the space to bring in someone at the caliber of a Tanev or a Hanifin, it looks to be really tough for the Maple Leafs.
Yeah, I don't know how that works. I mean, they really probably need to add someone, forward or defense, and I just don't know how that works. And yes, we've hammered them enough on Ryan Reeves, but it's not just Ryan Reeves. It's the David Kampf contract as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, Klingberg seems to be a long-term injured reserve potentially for the season, so that's irrelevant potentially in this discussion. So I don't know, because we're talking about Bertuzzi, Domi. I mean, Yarncroc's been playing almost relatively consistent top 6, if not third line minutes. So he's an important contributor. I don't know how Toronto does it, and they're probably the team that needs to most. Looking at other teams, the New Jersey Devils probably should be involved. They could use some help on the blue line. They're, after losing both Damon Severson and Ryan Graves this offseason, I think it's showing a little bit.
Yeah, so they were a team I don't know if it was mentioned that they were in on Zadorov, but they were definitely mentioned as, okay, this team could be a fit for that type of defensive guy. I would think, if I'm New Jersey, I'm interested in Hanifin or Tanev. I think, in theory, Tanev could fit very well there as far as what they're now missing, like you mentioned, Graves and Severson moving on. That said, Hanifin might be the better overall fit as far as also fitting the offensive game there. I don't think... Let me take a quick look. Maybe... I don't think I really have a preference. Right now, looking at New Jersey's roster, they're going to have Dougie Hamilton, John Marino as kind of their top right shot guys. Luke Hughes, I think, is sometimes playing on that offside. They've got a lot of left shots. Colin Miller's another right shot, and I'm not trading for Tanev because I have Miller. And then kind of looking at the left side of the defense, you've got Siegenthaler, who is a mainstay in the lineup, defensive guy, Kevin Ball, and then Brendan Smith, who honestly this year he's actually played a little forward as well. Again, not a player who's keeping me from acquiring a Hanifin or a Tanev. Just looking over the lineup, there's space for either one of those players. They definitely should be in on both of them.
I lean Tanev for the Devils a little bit. I like I think the fit and the need is a little bit better with the stay-at-home style. But I also think that whoever acquires Hanifin is going to make a run at signing him, and that might be reflected in the price. I think the Devils would be well off to almost go pure rental because they better hope next year Simon Nemec is ready. You don't spend a second overall pick to have him play that many years in the AHL. So this year, fine, playing down another year, but next year you want to pencil him in your lineup. So if you're bringing in a long-term kind of guy, it's because you're kind of a little bit down on Nemec, in my opinion. So obviously that doesn't have to be the case, but I don't know where you're fitting like a Hanifin longer term on this roster. So I lean Tanev for them just strictly kind of this year. I think stylistically he might be what they need, but I think he's also just a fit from an asset management standpoint better.
Okay, I can get on board with that for sure. Any other teams jumping out to you?
I want the Edmonton Oilers to be able to do something, but I don't think that's going to happen, at least with these players. So I'm going to say no there. If Boston wanted to change things up a little bit, again, we mentioned Grzelcyk earlier, we mentioned Derek Forber earlier. If they want to shift things around, move some money around, I don't know if this is the smartest option for them, but Hanifin having gone to college in the area, like maybe he makes sense and as a longer term option. Going from Grzelcyk to Hanifin would definitely be a good upgrade. I don't know if long-term that fits salary-wise, but just spitballing there. But I don't know. There's a lot of teams that just don't have the space, and I guess I'll throw out one more. Dallas Stars.
Dallas Stars absolutely would be a fit, and I think, one, they will be looking to improve their team. They're one of the top contenders. But two, when you look at their lineup, I would assume that they'd be looking to acquire a defenseman like up front. Their forwards, sure, you can always get some depth, but that's not really their issue or their weakness, I would say. There's definitely space in the lineup to improve their defense. Another thing with them, though, will be making the money work. So right now, they really don't have a whole lot of space, so they would need to be sending out a player or two. I'm not really sure who that would be.
The one thing that Dallas has going for them that other teams don't is they're not in long-term injured reserve yet. So they're going to accrue basically cap space. They're going to be able to take on more salary at the trade deadline than they can today. So Cap Friendly right now has them projected to have $2 million of salary cap space, which getting one of those at 50% retained that's only about $500,000 to maybe $1 million for Hanifin. So that could be a level of just shuffling guys up and down, doing some paper transactions until the playoffs. Like, not ideal, but it's a little bit more doable, I think, than saying you have to send a guy out.
Yes. I think that's an important factor to keep in mind, is not a team not using the long-term injured reserve is accruing the cap space. If they need to start using it, that stops. So it kind of, I would like to say everything goes perfectly for Dallas and they don't have to start using it. Some older names in their lineup, so I'm not 100% confident that I'd bet on that being the case. But yes, currently they're in a better spot than a lot of other teams because of that ability to accrue the cap space.
Just real quick math with the Stars. So I'm looking at kind of who they have and everything, waiver exemptions. Thomas Harley, waiver exempt. He's just under 900,000. So if you want Chris Tanev at 50% retained, you can send Harley down until the playoffs, and there's your space for Tanev. So it's very doable. Is that improving their lineup enough for the regular season? I don't think so, because he's one of their better defensemen at this point. But if you're looking to make something happen, you have, and again, another name I wouldn't want to send down, but you have him and Wyatt Johnson that you can kind of shuttle a little bit on paper or what. However, if you really desperately want to make one of those guys work.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't even come to that. I think they'd be looking at just some other more depth NHL guys like the Sam Steeles, the Joel Hanleys, that they would just risk losing one of them on waivers rather than remove Johnston or Harley from their roster. But I guess the main point here is it's doable for Dallas. It's not easy, but for a majority of the teams who are going to be buyers, it's not going to be easy. Another team I want to throw out there, and the more I look at their lineup, the less I know what they'll choose to do. Because in theory, they could make a move for a forward, a defenseman, or I would say definitely be interested in a goalie. Colorado Avalanche. I look at their lineup, they could use a little depth up front, especially in the bottom six. I think their top six is fine, but I guess even there they could improve. The reason they popped into my head for defense is with Sam Girard entering the I'm blanking on the exact name.
Player assistance program.
Yes. I definitely obviously do not know the seriousness necessarily of the situation in regard to how long he'll be out. He could be out for a month or two. It could be into next season. It's really tough to gauge. The only team that really has an idea of that is probably the Colorado Avalanche themselves. That said, what does it mean for them as a hockey team? Their defense is still pretty good, but they did lose a important piece. In theory, they could be interested in a Noah Hanifin or a Tanev. But like I said, looking at the roster, it's not a coin flip because there's 3 different positions they could look at. But I don't know. They have the space with LTIR. They could make a move work for either of those players fairly easily.
I don't want to open Pandora's box, but I think this needs to be floated. So Sam Girard, player assistance program, like, I don't want to diminish mental health or anything like that, but at the same point, if he were to conveniently stay in the program until the playoffs where there's no salary cap, I think there's going to be some teams that cry foul. And again, I don't want to make light of that situation, but if it starts getting towards the end of the season, he still feels like he needs help, he should continue to get that help, absolutely. But I think the closer it gets to the playoffs and rumblings start that he might return, I think some teams are going to get really upset with that situation, because that's not the intention of the program. That's not the intention of the salary relief. The intention is to have players who need assistance to go into it, and that's just not. I mean, that's the case in this situation, but him staying out until the playoffs to also provide salary relief would not be a good look for anyone involved, I think.
Yeah, it's in a way it could be a situation very similar to the teams that have some stars on long-term injured reserve. It would be that same type of. I don't want to necessarily use the same words like kind of cheating the cap system, but it could be viewed in that same light, definitely. So Colorado's. I brought them up for a Tanev or Hannafin, but really I guess I'm bringing them up for just about any player, because I think they could use anyone.
I would lean towards goalie for them if they were going to add somewhere. So
if I'm them, yes, I agree, but I will also mention that's not always the easiest position to acquire, so they could just be out of luck with that one.
I mean, I don't want to jump past Tanev, Hannafin if we got more teams, but kind of foreshadowing, the next number 6 on the list is Jake Allen or Caden Primo. This is, again, Frank Seravalli's list. Jake Allen, Caden Primo. Caden Primo is on a very inexpensive contract. He could make a lot of sense for Colorado's goalie need. But if you got more teams on defense, I'm happy to stay there for another minute.
I think that's. I'm gonna say I'm good with who we've talked about. Yeah, I'm good with who we've talked about.
So I guess that does move us to goalies. Next is Jake Allen or Caden Primo. I believe a little bit farther down on the list here, we'll lump some guys together. James Reimer. And then I also think even farther, so Reimer was 10 on the list. Okay, I was seeing if Mackenzie Blackwood was on here, but he's another name. He's not on Seravalli's board, but he would be another name in this goalie discussion. Probably choose your desired, I guess, person, and you could make a case for and against probably all those guys. So Jake Allen, Caden Primo, James Reimer, maybe Mackenzie Blackwood. So Allen and Primo 6th on Seravalli's big board. 10 is James Reimer, and then Blackwood isn't on the trade bait board, but his name's been out there enough as well.
Yeah, so we just talked about this, so this can be a very brief mention of them. Colorado. Georgiev is not playing too well this season, and I'm blanking on the name. Pavel.
Franco
yes.
is out, has went back home, so it seems like he's likely out for the season.
Yes.
If that hasn't already been announced. I forget if it was.
So I guess their plan in net is it's not working really this year. So they're definitely a team that I think could use a goalie. I would throw out Seattle. I don't know if that's the move they'll make, but we're kind of seeing the same Grubauer issue as we kind of knew to be the case. So I'd throw them out there. New Jersey's another team who I think they've actually been mentioned in rumors as they're kind of looking to see what's out there, at least as far as goalies, which makes sense because I think they were probably doing that in the offseason as well. There's some low-hanging fruit as far as a team who really needs to figure out their goaltending situation. I'll kind of turn it over to you and see if you grab that fruit.
I feel like I'm not going to grab the fruit you're handing me. I'm going to say the Carolina Hurricanes, though.
Okay.
Potentially with Freddie Anderson out. We don't know for how long, and then Antti Ranta's never stayed healthy for his career, unfortunately. So they could be someone who, depending on the injury situation to one or two of their guys, could be looking to add someone. So I know that wasn't probably the answer you were looking for, but
It wasn't, but I'd still like the answer of Carolina because we saw in the offseason some teams more than usual were stacking up on goalies, or at least kind of having 3 NHL guys. I think certain situations that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think other ones it does, and for Carolina, Anderson, Ranta, and Kochikov, that's one of those situations where like it does kind of make sense, and it's probably paying off for them right now that they did that because Anderson's out, Ranta's been hurt. They're kind of in need of another goalie still, but if they didn't have the 3, that'd be an issue.
Okay, fine. I'll pick the fruit this time. The Edmonton Oilers are who you're, I would assume, talking about.
Yeah, that was the fruit.
But I don't know if they're as low hanging as they are, but at the same point, it seems, I don't know if they just want to push this narrative, but every time I hear any insider talk about their goalie situation, they always say, well, Jack Campbell will probably be called back up shortly. They just wanted him to get some games, get his confidence back, and he'll be back. So I don't know if I fully, like, yes, they should acquire a goalie, but I don't know if I buy that that's what they're going to do, which is why I don't think I went there first.
So I think the way I'm reading that situation is the best case scenario is that they can bring Campbell back up and he's good to go. Because essentially their cap situation is not great. Campbell has been doing well in the past week down in the AHL, so maybe he is starting to gain the confidence back and can come back up and help. To me, those rumors of they might be calling him back up, I think that is more of a we need to try this because that working out is far better than I think the way the trade market is going to be for them. It's not going to be easy to make a move happen. They're going to have to ship someone else out if they need to make a move happen. So to me, I almost see it as they kind of have to give it one more shot, and then if it doesn't work, they kind of know goalie is the move.
I have one more team I want to throw out. I think it's more in the Carolina realm, but with how well the LA Kings have been playing and their goalies still being Cam Talbot and Phoenix Copley, I know it. Carrying 3 goalies is not the optimal thing to do, but if you're the LA Kings and you have arguably the best roster in hockey in front of your goalie, not giving yourself one more insurance policy might be a level of negligence, especially if it gets later in the season and someone's struggling a little bit, banged up a little bit, or just going into the playoffs with just those 2 guys. I strongly consider adding a third if I was them.
Well, so Copley hasn't been that great this year. Not a shocker. I think the comfort with him last year was he played a lot and won some games, but I don't necessarily think that was because of him. Talbot's been decent, but I think it's important, and you're pretty much getting right to this, is he isn't someone who should be relied on as the number 1, especially over a full season going into playoffs. To me, they are a fairly obvious team of if they're making a move, you think it has to be a goalie because of the strength of their roster. So I definitely like them as a fit for one of these guys. They've got some space from LTIR to work with. Yeah, I would actually, they might be one of my favorites to pick up a goalie because, yeah, the rest of their roster is so good that's kind of the clear, if they can patch that up, they could turn into a favorite pretty quickly.
If they aren't already.
Yes. Well, so I guess that's the big knock on them is their goaltending situation.
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time at the top of the board. So let's run through a couple more names. Adam Henrique's on here. I mean, he's I don't know. Any team looking for a veteran kind of option might be interested, but his salary is awfully high that I don't know how many teams are going to be able to afford him, even with 50% retained, 5.825. So it has to be one of the teams with space. Again, maybe this is a Carolina Hurricanes who just want to add some roster insurance type player.
That could be a situation, too, where you see the multi-team trade where he's kind of filtered through a third party to get some salary retained. Because that is a higher salary that in this current cap climate, it's going to be very tough to move.
Even doing something like that, we're still looking at a little bit under 1.5 million, and that's still not opening up a ton of teams, especially for. I mean, he's still a fine player, but like.
Well, that is the thing. Like you also then factor in the level of the player, and do teams care? Not care, but do teams see him as enough of an improvement to go through that whole process? Probably needing to use an extra asset to pay a team to retain it on top of what you have to give Anaheim. It could be tough to move him. I think he's still good enough that if a situation unfolds where they can get the salary down enough, he could be good for a contender.
Could also be a situation near the deadline where someone knows one of their higher salary guys is out to the playoffs and they have the long-term injured reserve space. I think that's where Henrique makes sense, because he makes sense from a roster standpoint, but just a cap standpoint right now, I don't see many fits. I think it's going to take an injury for him. Sean Walker, number 8. If I was the Maple Leafs, he might be the guy I'm trying to fit in because of that lower salary, less kind of maneuvering needing to be done.
Yeah, and I think he has a history, actually, of decent play. He had a bit of an off season, I think, after a fairly significant injury, if I'm remembering correctly. That's a guy that I think I'd be targeting as someone who is playing good hockey this year.
So a lot of those teams we talked about for defensemen, I think if you're one of the teams that want to bargain shop a little bit more, he's probably the best guy to do that with. Another number 9 on the list, Tony DeAngelo. I don't see anyone touching him. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but just his success recently has been with one team and only one team. I don't know if another team does that unless they're pure desperate. So maybe Toronto.
If someone, I would say if there's a team desperate for a defenseman, we need to break it down a little more and say if you're desperate for like a power play quarterback, then maybe if you're able to hide and shelter him on a third pair, but he does not really know how to play defense. So that's kind of, I don't know. I feel like you need to be in a very specific situation for Tony DeAngelo to make sense for you. I would almost bet that he just stays in Carolina.
I think there's one more name I want to talk about real quick. Mike Hoffman, number 11 on the list. I think a contender will make a move for him. Someone who he's going to bring power play, like he's going to score power play goals for someone. Early on, I mentioned the Sabres, if they wanted to make a move. Right now, the Sabres power play has been struggling. They're going to get healthy, but if they were looking for another kind of shooting option, veteran, again, if they want to put some pieces in the middle, he might be an interesting fit for them. Nashville, same thing. Even Pittsburgh, if they're looking for a little bit more firepower. I think there's teams out there. It's who has the space. Detroit Red Wings as well. I mean, I'm thinking of teams that want to continue to score goals. He'll come in and help do that.
Yeah, I agree. He's that depth addition for a team needing a little more scoring, and he's kind of the guy I don't even know who to compare him to, but I could see him going to a contender and just, like, he could end up getting scratched for the rest of the season, and he's kind of just that insurance. Need to plug him in on the power play, great. Somewhere bottom 6, fine. Can provide a little scoring maybe, but not someone who should cost a lot asset-wise. I do want to touch on one name quick further down the list, Jack Roslovich. I feel like on a better team, he might play a little bit better. His underlying numbers aren't great. They aren't bad. And he's on Columbus. So I would wonder, a team really needing a winger and maybe insurance at center, I feel like that could be an interesting fit. Also for a team that, and he is a pending UFA, but he's young enough that of all free agents, I would feel a little more comfortable if you like the fit retaining him on a longer-term contract. So that would be one I'd be curious about.
Everything you said, Nashville makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like get a look. If you make the playoffs, great. If you don't, but really you get a look at him, see if he's someone that could fit into your lineup a little bit longer term. And he's probably not going to come at a massive price, especially if you will take on his full cap hit. So Nashville to me would make a lot of sense there.
Yeah. Absolutely. I very much agree with that. And he's got the versatility that he could kind of just any need at forward for any team, you could probably make him fit. I would throw him into the group of names everyone lists for Buffalo. I think there could be a fit there. Carolina, I think Detroit, he would start to get a little, I don't know. We always mention how they kind of have the same type of players, and that's another one of those situations. But he could be a useful player for a lot of teams out there. So he's a little further down the board, but wanted to make sure we touched on him.
I guess second to last player on the board real quickly, Anthony Mantha has not worked out with Washington. Again, I don't think there's going to be a lot of suitors, but this is where a team like Nashville, I keep going back to them because they have cap space and they have a need at forward, and they're going to need some guys there longer term. If you can get a look at him for X amount of games, that might be a worthwhile little move for you to make, especially if you are kind of near the playoffs and like you're not sacrificing too much of a draft position by bringing someone like that in if they do catch a little fire for you. So Mantha with Nashville to me makes a little more sense. I don't see like many of those other contending teams really pulling the trigger on him.
Yeah, price-wise, I think Nashville fits for a lot of the higher-cost players. Thing with Mantha, I want to make sure to mention, it seems like just the fit with the Capitals, it hasn't worked. If I'm looking at his numbers, I kind of want to take the bet, especially that he's a pending UFA, so there's low risk there. He's still decent, at least from a underlying metrics point of view. So that would be one. A team like Nashville, yeah, it just would make a lot of sense for them to see if that's a fit.
I will say I didn't realize he was 29 years old. Will be 30 very soon. Like,
yes,
I feel like he hasn't been in the league that long. But oh gosh, I guess I'm old at this point. So so that's a little bit of a knock. Like you don't often, I don't know, touching 30-year-old power forward type wingers is not always the best proposition, but he's a guy that you might be able to buy really, really low on and get some level of production.
You want to be careful about a possible extension, but I think to acquire him this season, if you're pushing for the playoffs, it's worth it.
So we didn't hit every name, but I think as you start to get past like 10, 11, there's names that I think we got to see how the season plays out a little bit more before I'd be really think someone's going to be moving them.
Well, it's just one of those things. Like right now, how do you predict Cal Clutterbuck? He's number 17. Like there will be teams interested in a player like him, but tough right now. You could name pretty much every contender.
Yeah, I mean, Columbus with Andrew Peeke and Adam Boquist is interesting, but at the same point, I don't know. We've been through this ad nauseum in this episode. Who has the cap space to add at the present, and it's very few teams. So, yeah, I mean, that could be a bigger hockey trade, if you will. So, I don't know. If I was Columbus, I wouldn't necessarily be looking to do that anyways. So, Yeah, I think it's early, but I think the top 10 names were really interesting and fun to talk about.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's early, so there's going to be more names that end up being added to a list like this. So I'd like to see some trades happen. Zadorov just happened because it's fun. Speculation's fun, but it could still be quiet. It's early in the season. More names are going to be added. Situations kind of still need to play out to see who is really buyers and sellers.
Yeah, I think the next month or so is going to go a long way to teams starting to maybe shake around it once the new year kind of happens. So I think this is a fun one. Good timing with Frank Seravalli releasing that. 100 days to the NHL trade deadline, but 100 days is still a very, very long time. So with that, we appreciate you listening to this episode of the Max Stern Podcast. We appreciate you subscribing, following us on all platforms. I'm not going to read them again. They're at the beginning of the episode. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.